This has been a marvelous interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary session, and I'm so grateful for the people who organized it to bring us all together from our different disciplines. I named a field Age Studies, AGE Studies, about 25 years ago, and it was a dream. It didn't exist. And in a certain way, it still doesn't exist. But when I come to a conference like this, I see its possibilities. And I know also that the term is not well known everywhere. It's not well known all across the United States, and I've been told it's not well known in Norway, and I'm sure in parts of Britain too. So one other note before I begin. I am going to read my talk because I'm a writer and writers read. And I am amazed at how good everybody's English is when it's your second language or perhaps your third. So I'm going to offer the text. Anybody who wants the text can write to Liz, and with my permission, you can have it. Senexa. This is Senexa. I call her the crone goddess of age studies, and part one is about her and my creation of her. Age needs a tutelary deity, a woke goddess, to defy the blighting age of Alzheimer's and the ambivalent age of longevity. Human beings deserve a powerful and glorious crone who can teach our ageist world the value of later life. Never had I felt this need more strongly than when I finished my latest book, Ending Ageism, as you mentioned, thank you, or How Not to Shoot Old People. Over the years of research, I had collected an appalling record of injustices, and by the time I wrote the Declaration of Grievances that ends the book, that's a 2-page compilation of all the domains in which I see ageism operating in the United States and in some cases globally. So it's just 2 pages, and it's a separate, there's a website that contains it, and the website is in French, German, Spanish, and English. Not Norwegian yet. I need that. So by the time I wrote the Declaration of Grievances and had penned the motto, "Fear ageism, not aging," I realized that the dangers to us were more grievous than I had anticipated. Older cohorts, although diverse from every point of view, nevertheless constitute what I call a new minority in the United States and elsewhere. The minority who look like me, bearing the halo of almost white hair, whether male or female, can be prized by some, but can also be overlooked, neglected, scorned, abandoned, avoided. The mere appearance of agedness, as Chris Gilliard and Paul Higgs put it, may make my minority, like others, vulnerable to demotions in domain after domain. So, identifying strongly as a potential victim, I felt ageism to be the greatest obstacle to my continued self-realization, agency, comfort, and dignity, and access to rights. And ageism gets in the way of everyone else who hopes to grow good and old. Out of empathy and fear, then, despite my invincible secularism, I felt the ancient and primitive need to create a favoring deity who would have our backs. It is all of you who are taking custody of the contexts of the life course, in part by redefining aging. Still, to lack a movement, as we still do, if only in the short term, is to need a goddess. This is not to ignore, and now I'm referring to the title of your project, which is Historicizing Old Age. This is not to ignore the muse Clio, the daughter of the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne. But Clio often forgets us. Many historians, as well as others, take no notice of age. Clio has a little cognitive impairment. Thus, our field, age studies, which is a plethora of academic disciplines that takes age as its key subject, needs a particular champion. I speak in this part of my talk not as a historian, which I'm not really, but as a feminist age critic and an activist. Here, transparently before your eyes, I venture to create a visual symbol, a poetic conceit, a goddess of age and age studies. At first glance, she looks exactly like Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl in the Sistine Chapel. She has the same broad shoulders and the muscular arms, and she is able to hold open a mighty, heavy book. All the Sibyls have books. She has the biggest and the heaviest. So Liz Barry nicely used my image for this conference. I was delighted, and I named her. And I named her Synexa. So one of the changes that was made by Viv is that it says Libica in the Sistine Chapel. It says Synexa here. For the guardian of the life force, we need to claim the power of those shoulders and arms. In aesthetic terms, however, I needed to reappropriate the Renaissance Sibyl for current occasions. Appropriation is not stealing when its purpose is consciousness raising, or more exactly, historicizing, in the sense of respecting cultural changes over time, which is what the second part of my talk is about. So, any of you notice any changes made to the original artwork in the leap from Libyan Sibyl to Synexa? Good, yes. So, any woman who was an oracle at the Libyan oasis would have had one of the skin tones of our universal African ancestors. So one contemporary artist, Fran Foreman, a colleague of mine at Brandeis, endowed her with an olive epidermis. The Libyan Sibyl was considered by the Greeks to have been the first woman to chant oracles, and thus she is the oldest of the prophetesses, and that's why I chose her too. So another colleague of mine, Laura Brody, bestowed on Synexa another change, you notice? Yes, yes, a becoming silver gray coif. My aim is to underline age and race, although Michelangelo failed to embody them. Okay, Synexa, with an A, is the gender of her name is all important. By the addition of a final vowel, Synexa is not a Synex. The Synex, a figure of ridicule in Roman theater, the pantaloon of Commedia dell'arte, who survives into later comedy, was a grudging skinflint who withholds a young man's allowance, interferes with his love life, and threatens to disinherit him if he disobeys. So comic writers took the side of the sons, and they trained their youthful age gaze on nothing but the geezer's back, his dirty old man amours, and his tempting financial hoard, which we have had George allude to recently. The reign of severe, inflexible geronts, stout disciplinarians who could not be tricked or cajoled, led eventually around 1900 to the crisis of gerontocracy, where the sons strove to overthrow patriarchal power, and Sigmund Freud of Vienna helpfully invented a psychic cause, the Oedipal complex, for the boys' revolt against the dads. So keep that period, the decades around 1900, in mind as I move on to the next section of my talk on longevity. The male rebellion against the fathers is also, some of you know this already, the era of the new woman. And with women working towards more equal rights for themselves on all battlefronts. And remember this, fights often start where gender and age merge. Synexa suffers from no traditional male baggage. Age Studies, our new umbrella field, claims her, portrayed as she is while reading her great thick volume. I call it the Book of Age. A super Wikipedia collection of all writings concerning age throughout recorded history. So the Book of Age contains all the wisdom and all the folly about the ages of life that has been produced across the millennia. A critical historian as well as a scribe, Senexa reveals the folly, she reveres the wisdom, and she explains the difference, if she were real. And she is interrupting her instruction of children, see, all important instruction of children, urgent, as that is, to seek missing material. In the Book of Age, huge gaps exist where we want solid information and careful interpretation. So, age studies intersects with the other body-based theorizations, gender, race, disability, etc. Like feminists and anti-racists, age scholars and artists may not only provide the necessary backup for our present interests, but which I think even more fun, they may challenge received opinion or false facts. What a noble opportunity this year, 2018, provides for challenging false facts. This is what I hope to do next, in a small way, confronting our so-called era of the new longevity. To do that, I dug into an earlier longevity archive. And first, I had to discover that there was an earlier data-driven longevity archive. So part 2 is called Inside the Longevity Archive. We are expected to feel proud to be living in an age of longevity, however ambivalent some of us may feel about growing old. Our length of life should be a source of pride, not because it is unique in the history of growing old, but because it signals more democratic access to health and later life. It is no longer only the rich and honored who are privileged to die old, as they have done since Sophocles lived to be 90 around 400 BC. Irritation or outrage, rather than, say, neutral curiosity, often provoke an historical inquiry. What raised my blood pressure was the use to which longevity data is now put as a demographic shock, unquote, signaling a so-called global socioeconomic crisis. The terms graying America and aging boomers emerged as catchphrases, not to celebrate long life, but to finger the costly old, read unproductive people burdening the country. Useless and greedy elders, shades of Roman comedy, are pitted against the pitiful, hardworking, or sadly unemployed young, who can't be expected to provide for everybody. Age critics early noticed this political squint. Alarmist demography, Steve Katz called it. Another statistical panic, warned Kathleen Woodward. And I blame disaster capitalism. This is this morning's theme. Borrowing from Naomi Klein, since the right-wing remedies for scarcity inveterately involve diminishing Social Security or pensions, the major safety net for the old in these chancy economies that are threatened by globalization and neoliberalism. My first point, then, no data get highlighted as shocking by the mainstream media without serving some powerful political interests. But scholars use spin too. Some scholars, like the media, particularly like to contrast the glorious life expectancy now with the United States back in 1900, on which they confer status as a dark ages of early death. They ignore the experts that I will be focusing on, writers in Britain and the US, who long before 1900 were congratulating themselves on living into the era of new longevity. So my story starts around 1865 with the relatively new field of large-scale life course statistics, big data. They, too, were beginning to have big data, and they were just as impressed by it as some of us are. This showed more people living longer than in the known past. The great fall in the death rate of recent years, George Longstaff, an English MD, put it in 1891, was becoming a part of general knowledge. We are living longer. But the first important difference to note is that the writers of the time, in interpreting this, had nothing at all to say about excessive numbers of old people. And they never mentioned uselessness or expensiveness. There were, of course, no pensions yet to be clawed back. At first, the newly available data was used to limn a simple, modern progress narrative. As early as 1869, the president of the recently founded American Statistical Association, Dr. Edward Jarvis, in his book, The Increase of Life, reported that an Englishman, Englishman, who had reached the age of 40 in 1864 could expect to live a full 26 years more, 40 plus 26, to 66. And if he were already 50 to 55 years of age, he still had 22 years and 2 months added to his earthly existence. And they had a pitiful comparison to the antique Roman. For them, the antique Roman was the bad old days. So the white, middle class, British male might live to 77, and that's not so different from right now, is it? So Jarvis drew an unexpected conclusion that I find very interesting, and that is a person certainly got a year older every year, but not a full year closer to death. In fact, the longer he lived, the longer he was likely to live. Age, chronological age, had become a newly important measure in the first half of the 19th century. Sari Edelstein, a literary critic, believes that there was a seismic shift in thinking about the human life course at this time. The 1790 U.S. Census had simply recorded whether free white males were older than 16 or younger. That was adulthood. But the 1850 census asked for your exact age. A specific numerical age. Between 1850 and 1900, the science of statistics was inventing a new kind of life course knowledge that was based on information soon optimistically called life expectancy, as if an individual could count on it. Well, people then were able to invent the middle years of life because there were enough decades between youth and old age. And George Eliot is one of the first people to use the expression middle years. For bolstering their progress narrative, commentators sifted the data not by measuring life expectancy from years anticipated at birth, but by starting at a later age, as you may have noticed. They understood that measuring life expectancy from birth, when there were low percentages of infant and child survivors, that dimmed the prospective narrative. It didn't make it look so good. Similarly, scholars today selected data from 1900 that do start at birth, because that makes the life expectancy numbers around 1900 look brutally low. 49 years is the average age at death, often cited now by people who don't know how they did it. So that contrast, we say they lived to 49, they said we lived till 77. That has the effect of supporting our own superior life expectancy a century or so later, and that in turn can be presented polemically as a result usually of medical advances. Pache, the doctors in the audience, they did it all: smallpox vaccine, safer obstetric medicine, and later antibiotics. It was mostly public health, actually, as the public health people know. We still use the term life expectancy, which was invented in a century of faith in progress. So a second point is that in order to do conscientious and appropriately historicized life course studies concerning the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th in these countries, current students of what is called mentalité should use the data that those scholars used then, or at least say that it existed, because it was an expectation of age at death starting no earlier than, say, age 20 or 40 or 55. And we know the problems they had with registration of deaths and whatnot. I mean, we know that the information was inaccurate, like some of our own. We use their data, however, to obtain a more intelligible entree into their life course psychology, in particular, men's hopes and fears, as recorded in their explanatory inclinations, because data just dream of explanation. So I'm going to underline the noun men. men had the pen in their hands, and they made a strange psychosocial and narrative use of this innovative and surprising big data set. And the universalizing congratulations did not last long, for the data showed something astounding. Women were living longer than men. Longevity was not universal. For the first time in history, the question about longevity may be raised and phrased as which body benefits. Longevity was indeed already viewed as a human competition, but the competition arose not between the generations, as our commentators painfully insist, but between the genders. And the gender data were greeted by the male explainers, mansplainers, we're now calling them in the United States, with emotions of amazement and gloom. Without a doubt, the data showed, quote, the greater frailty of men, unquote. Or, in the astonishing phrasing of one authoritative writer, Havelock Ellis, the greater tendency of men to die. This news struck a blow at male pride and status. Masculine supremacy over women, on which the theory of separate spheres and innate maternalism depended, was struck a blow. So, how did they explain the greater frailty of men? Since the commentators were often older men, for them the real news was men's weakness in their middle years. In 1874, Charles Ansell published a pamphlet showing that in both the upper classes and in English life in general, while at birth there were more males than females, the preponderance in the number of males diminishes as the age advances in consequence of the mortality among them being greater than among the females. Ansell's startling graph, he has a graph, but I'm not showing it. It shows midlife women in the upper classes way below everyone else in their death rate, with the dips first, pay attention ladies, first at 30 and then after age 41. Okay, the lowest rate of female mortality in the second dip comes at exactly age 45, a figure to keep in mind in evaluating the dire 19th century menopause texts that I have written about elsewhere. In the laboring classes, too, women had a higher mortality rate before 40, but after 40, which was the end of their risky childbearing, even their death rate sank. These are laboring classes women, coming close to that of upper-class males. You can see how upset people could be. In Dr. Longstaff's 1891 book titled Studies in Statistics, he emphasized that the female advantage came in midlife. The superior longevity of women is well known. And by 1916, another doctor took for granted postmenopausal women's advantage. That women often gained additional strength of constitution is shown by the greater longevity of women, by their being less liable to sudden death, and by their general immunity from disease. Okay, I'm going to move right on. Parenthetically, gendered data were first collected by life insurance companies, which needed the information to establish actuarial tables, premium rates, and annuity amounts. So the gender advantage, the gender differential rather, meant that there would be higher premiums for men. Mere premium cost cannot, however, explain the distressed tone of these discourses. That competitive word, superior, loomed over the dissemination of the explanations. Words for women like additional strength, constitution, general immunity show how impressed these men were. The most influential texts were overtly defensive about men. Havelock Ellis spoke in terms of the greater tenacity of life in women and their greater constitutional youthfulness versus the greater frailty of men. That expression comes from Ellis. Ellis's text, Man and Woman, a very binary text, ran through many editions between 1901 and 1929, making women's superiority well known on both sides of the Atlantic. Reading this language now, we may wonder how big the gender gap was to be taken as so alarming to collective male self-esteem. So, anybody want to guess how big the differential was?
3 months. 3 months. Anyone challenge 3 months?
I thought people would have bigger numbers.
I would have said 5 years.
Okay. It was 2 to 3 years. So, Marlene's in the right direction now, but we can't guess what it would have been if it was 3 months, whether they would have done the same thing. So, it was in 1929, there was still a writer announcing that women live 2 to 3 years longer than men. In some data, it was a bigger gap. Okay. But data about the actual difference is usually omitted. It's actually rather hard to find anybody who says what the difference is in that period, as if men were so overwhelmed by the female advantage, however petite, that they didn't need to investigate the exact state of affairs or, admit it. The effect was to elaborate a threatening female life force. So, some specialists looked not for the strength of women, but for the social, medical, and cultural causes of male deaths in the middle years. So there's a little bit of writing about that. And Dr. Longstaff reported that in England and Wales, the number of deaths attributed to cancer was double that of 40 years before. And Ellis mentioned as male diseases diabetes, Bright's disease, which is a kidney ailment, and aneurysm. And they're much more frequent in men. In fact, about half the excess male mortality in America in 1910, but possibly elsewhere as well, could have been explained by industrial accidents. No national support for, and not enough unions with power to control that. And as late as 1929, some of you will have thought of this already, syphilis still accounted for more than twice as many male deaths as female ones. And so that enlarged the over 40 differential. So, looking sensibly at class and lifestyle differences, syphilis is a lifestyle issue, could have implied that male life expectancy could have been improved. But in fact, aging became the scapegoat. In a brief 1922 article in The Lancet, published the same year that G. Stanley Hall's book popularized the term senescence, an anonymous writer tartly observed, "Rupture of a cerebral artery in a man aged 45 is commonly caused by syphilis. No help is given by describing it as early senescence." That was why aneurysm was so common in men. Such medical deconstructions of biological aging are actually rare even now. If you can say it's all aging, then you have solved a problem, according to many medical people. Okay, feeling he needed to better explain female life expectancy, Ellis ignored his own medical data to use familiar maternal ideology, but with a twist. You can do one thing or the other. You can explain why men die, you can explain why women don't die. Okay, this is the explanation for why women don't die. The female is the mother. She is thus of greater importance than the male from nature's point of view. We therefore find that the female is more resistant to adverse influences. Women had a sluggish nature, but this was a virtue because it meant that you were slower to age and the less liable to destruction. Ellis borrowed a theory of female biological resilience, which was a universal, essential, non-historical, non-cultural, binary theory from two guys, Patrick Geddes and Arthur Thompson, The Evolution of Sexuality, which also went into many editions. And I'm not going to go into this except that it blamed one part of the blame for why men did not recover so quickly was because they had ejaculations, and those were still considered little deaths, just as they had been in the Renaissance. So, I mean, it sounds loony if you don't know the history of this discourse, but Anyway, the shock men experienced in dealing with these revelations came from its challenge to the widely accepted 19th century idea of the weakness of women. Women just had to be more frail in physique and more delicate in health and more feeble in brain to be suited for a circumscribed female life, stay in the house. Now, that separate sphere, they called it, looked irrefutably hale, even strong, even superior. So, such a vital, enduring midlife woman, constructed by male experts, was magnified in her effects on men by the burgeoning of the women's movements. Recall the New Woman that I mentioned originally, and they were making demands in many areas of life that impinged on men: ending sex trafficking, ending prostitution, ending drinking, and struggling to wrest the vote. So behind longevity discourse lay actual new middle-class women becoming stronger, not just physically, but psychically, or let us say discursively and symbolically. So the cultural industry of this time magnified this new character in the social text through novels and plays about her and for aspirational readers. So there were women as students, as workers, as typewriters, as musicians, as saleswomen, nurses, teachers, social workers, writers, and they were all wearing these newfangled, uncorseted clothes. Horrifying. And in England for half a century, there had also been an excess of women over men that was caused by male emigration, colonial adventurism, and wars, as well as the ill health of men. So the scandal of women's longevity may have been worsened by this bothersome feeling that there was an accumulation of surplus women, which is what Havelock Ellis called it. And then there was World War I, which hideous destruction of young men. So that further explained the female surplus. And then the commerce in anti-aging came in. Cosmetic surgery became plausible after World War I. And it wanted men, this new commerce in aging, as I call it, and it wanted men to turn to nostrums, to act young, to be more like women. But it was still true in 1929 that the women are outliving the men. In the eyes of men, in short, there was revolution everywhere. But I would suggest that the advances of feminism, such as they were, would not have threatened men so intimately if they had not been accompanied by this one all-important, biological, scientifically proven instance of actual male physical inferiority of life itself, as read through the longevity data. George Bernard Shaw may have been laboring under this shock of women's inherent fortitude when he wrote his play, published in 1903, that I prefer to call Man and Superwoman. That, of course, what happened next, I don't tell you. Wait for it. Of course, various forces recuperated male superiority, as we all know, even though the longevity divide grew, and now it's, 8 years in some countries. So, some conclusions. My time in the archive, which was a shallow dive into one period of intersectional interpretations, reminds the Norwegians in particular, that historical digging is indispensable. There are so many unanswered, indeed unasked questions about the history of age. What happened to quash the notion of longevity as proof of female strength? What came of the brief golden summer of midlife female superiority? Was that indeed the first longevity discourse to be based on data that was available to the contemporaries? Because we know other things about longevity data from Florence in 1427. Why do I compare two periods of longevity discourse? I said early on that no demographic data gets highlighted as shocking without serving some powerful interest. So their interest was male domination, which was being threatened. In our time, the agents of darkness wreak generational competition for the sake of lessening our earned entitlements. If Senexa were to speak, robed in orange, crowned in gray, a global prophet of age for our ageist age, she might say, use data cautiously and be honest about what you're doing with it. And finally, a much larger percentage of Americans reach old age now in comparison with any past time. But this should not lead us where it has led us. Not to crisis discourse, not to credulity about those fantastic promises to the 0.001% of living to age 150, nor should it lead to celebrating longevity per se, nor to praising American medical science, but to celebrating as much as we have achieved of what I call equal longevity. Equal longevity. Longevity is far from democratically dealt out. Discrepancies in health and in murder and suicide rates kill Native American men, young African American men, babies, and long unemployed white men prematurely. And the means for reaching a democratized equal longevity for all should be incorporated into national health care goals as a human right and as a social justice issue. So all of you here, I consider all of you age studies scholars in old disciplines and new interdisciplines, and writers and artists, have been filling the latest pages in the Great Book of Age that Michelangelo placed in Senexa's arms. You are the vanguard of the anti-ageist movement, being willing to provide necessary backup, true facts, or at least good questions, and surrounding context that may support healthy argument now and be available for future discoveries and revisions. So, under Senexa's aegis, and with the help of the broad, unending, wide-open Book of Age, better written than in times past, and to be better written in future times, may the humane vision of the life course overcome. Thank you.